This video is going to be dealing with some basic drywall tools, talk a little bit about joint compound or mud as it's also commonly referred to as. And as you can see, I'm going to try to pan this around without shaking it too much. I've got an assortment of tools and supplies that we'll talk about a little bit more in depth. And we got some power tools here that we'll talk about. First thing we're going to talk about is this bucket of mud right there. All-purpose joint compound. You can get this in smaller buckets for small jobs. You can get different grades of mud. You've got +3, you've got finishing mud. Me personally, I just pretty much stay with the all-purpose joint compound. I can pretty much do everything that I need to do with that without having a bunch of different buckets and boxes. Some of the mud comes in boxes. So I just stick with the all-purpose joint compound. That thing up on top of that, I just opened that bucket. This is actually my second attempt at making this video because there was some stuff I forgot to grab and I don't want to stop it. But on top of this bucket here is a bucket opener. And what we're going to do with this, you can open this by hand by pulling up each individual tab. It's okay when the bucket's full, but when it starts to get less than half full, then you got to hold the bucket and pull up. And either way, it's rough on your fingers. What I've already done is I've already removed this strip from around the base of the bucket so that these wings will open up. And then what you do is you take your bucket opener, and this works for 5-gallon buckets of paint, and any 5-gallon bucket lid. Okay. So just pull it off of there. Now, let me get the camera up a little bit closer and get out of the light. This bucket, this mud is already mixed, but you're going to have to mix it yourself again. No telling how long this bucket sat on the shelf, how long ago it was made. I've seen mud that's actually separated where the majority of the liquid was down at the bottom of the bucket and the stuff up on top, the actual mud itself, was pretty dry. And there's a couple different ways of mixing that mud. Let me get this a little bit closer. If you've seen my other videos, surprise, surprise, I'm actually using a camera, a video camera, and a tripod. Trying to make the quality a little bit better since surprisingly I've got subscribers now. Now I know the majority of people probably subscribe for the camping and the elk camp and hunting videos, but this is what I do when I'm not out in the woods. So, like I said, if it's not separated where the liquid is on the bottom and the majority of the mud's on top, then what you can do is that you can small batch it into a container such as this. This is called a mud trough. This is a 14-inch stainless steel one. They also make them in plastic. There's some good features about plastic. Normally the plastic, or the ones that I like, they have a rounded, instead of the 90 or the sharp corners here, they have a rounded profile, so it's a lot easier to get your mud out. Durability wise, stainless steel is the way to go. If you do buy a plastic one, make sure that it has a metal edge inserted into the plastic on at least one side for scraping your knife off. If not, you're going to wear the plastic away pretty quick. So what you can do with this mud is you can small batch it, put it in your container, and usually I use my 6-inch taping knife, and I scoop it out and I'll get it in there. I won't fill this all the way full. A third to a half is probably as full as you want to go. And one reason is because you're going to be holding this in your hand, and that will get heavy after a while. And the other reason is you want to have room to work your mud. So I'd fill it up maybe a third of the way to a half, and then I would just sit there and mix it back and forth until it got smooth with my knife. The other thing I want to talk about, well, before we go any further, the other way to mix this in the bucket is one of these hand mixers. Looks like a giant potato masher. And I specifically bought it just for this video. I was going to take it back and get a refund because I've got the other implement I'll show you in a minute. But I started thinking about it and I'm like, damn, you know, sometimes I do laundry in elk camp in a 5-gallon bucket, and this would make a hell of a clothes washer. You know, you put your clothes in the soapy water and you can sit there and mash it and mix it and whatnot. So I'm going to keep it. I'm going to keep it. But I'm going to set it to the side. But anyway, well, before I set it to the side, what you would do is you would just sit there and use it like a masher, and you would mix this mud up. And I'm going to tell you, it'll be hard. This stuff is pretty thick, and after a couple of minutes of that, you'll wish you had one of these other things I'm fixing to show you. The other way to mix that mud is with a mud mixer. Let me make sure I've got this in frame here. Tripod's new, a little stiff, but this one's made by Rigid, and it looks like a heavy-duty drill. Basically, that's what it is. It's got forward and reverse, but it's a really heavy-duty motor. It's high torque, which you need to mix this mud. And then the attachment for it is this mixing paddle here. And what you're going to do is you're going to run that down into the mud, plug the mixer in, and go to town. Like I said, it's got forward and reverse. Right here you can see forward and reverse, and it's a labor saver. I don't recommend using this paddle right here with just a normal household drill. Maybe if you've got a heavy-duty one, it might work. But like I said, this right here is specifically made for mixing mud, mixing mortar, thin set mortar if you're doing tile. You can mix paint with it, but you can mix paint with a mixing paddle and a regular drill because the paint's not quite as dense and thick as that mud. And you can probably rent one of these. I know I'm talking to a lot of people and they're never going to have this many tools because they may be doing a room, or, you know, like I am, finishing a basement or something like that on their own. So, you know, look at the rental places that rent tools for these different items I'm talking about. However, I do it enough that by the time I spent a year renting the tools that I need, I'd have more than paid for them if I just bought them myself. So anyway, mud mixer with a mud paddle. That's the way to go to mix this mud. The other thing I want to talk about with this mud is that it is water soluble, and so as the water evaporates out of it, the mud hardens. Whenever you open this up, chances are when they whipped this and they filled it, it left, well, soap makers will know, it's called a trace. You know, it holds its form and it gets on the lid. Now this stuff on the lid will harden up, and what I like to do is I like to get that off of there either by first I knock it with a knife, and then I'll wash it and get that mud off, because taking this lid, putting it back on, taking it off, putting it back on, this will fall off down into your mud, and it'll leave, for lack of a better word, mud nuggets. And then when you're putting it on the wall, there's nothing worse than putting a nice smooth coat of mud down your seam just to find out you had a mud nugget in there, and it left a big old track right down the middle of your nice smooth mud. So I will take that off, just not right now, for expediency's sake. Mud, you want to keep it covered at all times. If you're consistently working, you're going, you know, you're filling your trough a third to a halfway, and you're working your mud, you run out of mud, and then you come back for more, but you want to keep this covered, not necessarily tight while you're working, but if you're going to leave this bucket for more than a few hours, you're going to want to get a hammer and knock this down so it seals tight all the way around. This mud will dry out on you very quickly, especially when you're digging from the middle, which is where the majority of your mud's going to come from. What I like to do is, once I start taking the level down, I'll use my knife when I'm getting more mud, and I'll scrape the sides and keep these sides as clean as possible, because just even uncovering it to get more mud, and covering it and uncovering and covering and whatnot, the mud film on the sides will dry. It'll flake off and again cause mud nuggets. Don't want mud nuggets. So like I said, if you're going to leave it more than a few hours, hammer it down, and that's why you want to get that dry crusty stuff off there too, because eventually that will shake loose. But that's why you keep this handy and around, and that way it's not such a pain in the butt when you're trying to get more, or when you come back to open your mud to do the job some more. And yes, that's heavy. 68 pounds is what that weighs. Okay, I think next we'll talk about tape. When you're putting your drywall up, you're going to have seams where the different sheets fit together. And I'm sorry, I'm working this by myself. I don't have a camera person, so I may not always be in frame. But you're going to have seams where the panels join together up in the corners. Got a soffit there because there's a dryer vent running in there. And what you do prior to mudding that is you use what's called tape. There's a couple different kinds of common tape on the market. One is old school. It's called paper tape. And I don't have a roll of it because I don't use it and I don't like it. This is actually tape. If you don't do it properly, you can just ruin a job. And this is tape that I've had to pull off some of these joints because the person that did it didn't do it right. And like I said, this is paper tape. It comes in a roll. And the way you properly do this tape is that you have to put a base layer of mud on your joint. Then you set this tape into the mud. So again, sorry, no camera person. So you would run a base layer of mud on this seam here. Then you would take this tape and you would hold it in place, you know, pretty much the whole length of the seam. And then you would get a taping knife, which is basically a 6-inch sheetrock or mud knife, and then you would lightly skim coat this paper tape with another layer of mud. And if you don't do it right, you don't get good adhesion between the base layer of mud and this tape. It'll bubble on you, it'll sag, So it's more of a problem to work with than another option I have. So this goes away. This is called fiber tape, and it's basically a mesh tape. It is slightly adhesive on the back. It's not masking tape or duct tape by any means, but it's sticky enough to where it'll stick to your wall. It might not stick the greatest on this mud here, it's dusty, but it'll stick to the wall. I think that's in frame, yeah. So what you would do is you would run that tape all the way down your joint, then come back, and I like to start in the middle of the wall, work one direction and work another. That prevents you, like I said, it is adhesive, but it's not real sticky. So that'll, if you start in the middle and work up, and then start in the middle and work down, you have less chance of pulling the tape from the pressure of the mud and the knife. You have less chance of pulling the tape down the seam, and it stays in place. You can just buy a roll of this and just run it by hand. You know, use a carpenter's knife to cut it, but I like this little dispenser, kind of like a packing tape dispenser. One thing it's got this wheel right here, and it's a 45-degree angle on each side of that ridge, and that is for running it in corners. Let me try to find a good corner here. There we go. So what you would do is you would get it up here in the corner, stick that wheel in the corner, run this tape down, and it's got a cutter on it already, so it just cuts the tape, and there you go. Tape is run into the corner, then you would just go back and put your mud on it. If you're doing a flat seam, such as this one right here, then all you do is you pinch these little yellow tabs together, move that out of the way, and then you have a smooth wheel down there. And like I said, it's got a little built-in cutter. Takes a standard carpenter's knife blade and just comes down and cuts it. So this is how I tape my joints. Next thing we're going to talk about, we talked about the mud trough already. I've got something else here. It's called a mud hawk. So we already talked about this. We'll get that out of the way. This is a mud hawk, and all it is a platform. You put your mud, put a pile of mud on here. Let me get this in frame. You put your mud on here, and then you can use your knife, work it around. I use this for smaller, like when I'm going back to fill nail holes, or excuse me, screw holes, since I don't use sheetrock nails. And it's good for small batches. So it's more comfortable to hold it like this than to try to hold a trough, and makes a really good mixing platform to get your mud nice and smooth. Because even after I mechanically mix the mud in the 5-gallon bucket, when I pull mud out, put it in my trough or put it on my hawk, I still mix it again with the knife. That's just something I look for nuggets, and I just like to have my mud as smooth as I can. So, mud hawk out of the way. Next we're going to talk about, well, let's talk about cutting sheetrock. There are a lot of different implements on the market. They make like panel cutters. You set the whole sheet in there and you can cut it just by sliding a knife blade down it that's connected to like a carriage and whatnot. I'm not doing all that. What I use to strike my straight lines, anything that's straight will work. In a pinch, you can use the edge of a scrap piece of drywall, as long as it's got the factory edge on it. But normally what I use a 4-foot level, 4 feet, because most of your cuts, like if a sheet of normal drywall is 4 feet by 8 feet. There are other pieces, 6 by 12. I think there's 8 by 12. But normally what I work with, especially since I'm working by myself, is 4 by 8, because anything bigger than that is heavy. And it's hard to maneuver downstairs and whatnot. So I use a 4-foot level to strike my cut lines. Obviously, you're going to need a tape measure. Again, sorry, I'm trying to keep this in frame. And generally for my straight cuts, I'll use a carpenter's knife, such as this right here. What I like about this Stanley is that it has blade storage in the handle. You can store like 6 blades in there. So when you dull a blade, and they do dull fast in this sheetrock, you're not running around trying to hunt another blade. I've covered this in another video when I was setting a box into existing sheetrock. This is called a jab saw. This is good for making interior holes, like for outlets and in the ceiling, your ceiling boxes, switch boxes and whatnot. So if you need to make a hole in the center of this panel, you would draw it out, and then you'd use this jab saw here. You can see it's got a very sharp point to jab it into one corner, and then saw your way down, jab it in again until you make your cuts. I also use this for cutting sheetrock if I have to cut two cuts in it. Say for example, for whatever reason, I had to cut this corner out to make it fit around an obstruction or something else. So what I would do is I would draw it out, and then at least one of the cuts I would make with the drywall saw, the jab saw, until I got to the corner of where I need to stop. And then, because it is quicker, I would take the knife and then score the line from the outside edge to the corner, meet up with the jab saw cut, and then you just give it a pop. You don't have to score it real deep. It'll break on your score line. You fold it over, and then you finish cutting the backing paper on the sheetrock. You can make corner cuts like that with a knife. It's just a pain in the butt because you got to cut all the way through one of those lines. Yeah, and if you got to sit there and keep going at it with the knife, don't try to cut it all at once with a knife. It will not work. So you got to make progressively deeper cuts on one line till you get all the way through, make your score line, and then snap it. So using the drywall saw is a lot more efficient and faster in that regard. Talking about shaping sheetrock, make sure I got this in frame. This is a drywall rasp. I call it a cheese grater. And what this is for, it's for smoothing down or forming the edge of sheetrock. And it'll cut through the paper backing and the paper face of the sheetrock, as well as grind away the core, the gypsum core. It's made out of gypsum. That's why some people call it gypsum board as well. So one of these, like if you've cut a panel to fit into the wall somewhere and you cut it a little bit too big, or the lines are not exactly straight and it won't fit in there, instead of trying to scrape away at it with a knife, you use a drywall rasp. And there's several different types, but this is the one I have on hand right now. Okay, next we'll talk about fasteners. What I have are screws and nails. So I have to bend down. These are drywall nails. They've got some kind of black finish, it says on there somewhere. A phosphate coating on it. I think it's a rust preventative, because you will be mudding over those after you sink them. And it helps, you know, the mud's got water in it and it keeps it from rusting. I use these in specialized instances. I don't normally hang